Hi, everyone. I'm Maria Mears. I'm the Director of Adult Education at the McLean County Museum of History. This is Crafting History, which is a series on historic crafts that emphasize sustainability. And we are doing these every other month now at the museum. For the first one we did a couple months ago, Remembering Rag Rugs, that was in April. And it was also virtual as well, just like this one. And then moving forward, we're going to try to do hybrid as well. So trying to keep them as accessible as possible. But this next to me right here, this is Michaela Harris. She's our Director of Communications. We also have our collections assistant, Morgan, in the room as well. And then Jackie Cain will be leading us. She is our Curator of Collections, and I would say she's an expert in historic craft. So Jackie will give us a little presentation about historic dyes and the history of historic dyes. And please feel free, if you have questions at any time, please put them in the chat or go ahead. And I think there's not a lot of us, so you can just go ahead and interject if you want as well. It's not a big deal. And we love to answer questions. So please, if you have any, feel free. And also, just a reminder, we are recording this. So for people that couldn't make it to the Zoom presentation today, this will be accessible on our YouTube page after the presentation. So you can go back as well, people that are here, if you want more insight on this, if you need to go back and see something, we'll have that on our YouTube page shortly. So just a reminder, this will be recorded. Okay, Jackie, it's all you.
All right, so like Maria said, I am our Curator of Collections, and today I'm gonna lead you through some of the techniques for dyeing, and you're gonna be able to do your own solar dye. So like Maria said, if you haven't already started soaking your fabric, go ahead and do that. And while you're doing that, we're gonna talk a little bit about the history of natural dyes. So natural dyes have been around almost as long as people have. The earliest recorded natural dye that we've seen in archaeological record actually dates back to 2600 BC in China. But you can see natural dyes pretty much through every civilization, including ancient Egypt, ancient Greece. Some of the most common colors that you saw were some of the easiest to make. So blues, because that came from indigo. Reds could really easily be accomplished with certain types of berries and clay materials. And I'm sure some of you have heard in the past that the color purple in ancient times was used to represent royalty. And the reason for that is actually how difficult it was to make that particular natural dye. So you'll see on the screen, I have an example of a tiny little shell. So these little mollusks were used to make purple dye. They were actually crushed and ground into a fine powder. And 100 of those little shells made just about 1 ounce of a very pigmented purple dye. It was very time consuming, resource consuming, and that is one of the reasons that only royalty was able to have these purple cloaks and these purple dyes available to them. So as you can see with natural dyes, for most of history, natural dyeing was the only dyeing that was done. People looked at the resources around them and took inspiration from that to create these beautiful colors. But as the global textile industry advanced, our need for dyes advanced, and thus came about the synthetic dye. So if anyone has ever used RIT dye products, that is a lot of times a form of synthetic dye that uses chemicals to ensure the dye process. Now, while RIT can be great for dyeing materials, it does have some downsides. Synthetic dyes, actually only about 80% of the dye goes into the actual fiber. And as a result, about 20% of the dye is leftover waste that gets dumped into our water system. So the global textile industry actually produced about 40 to 50,000 tons of dye waste in the last year alone. So this is one of the reasons why we wanted to kind of bring up this project to show people that there are other sustainable options that are also cheaper options. You know, as the title says, a lot of these dyes are things that are dinner scraps. They're really easy to get your hands on, and it's better for the environment to practice natural dyeing. So we're going to go over the different steps of the dyeing process so that you can understand what you do before we go step by step together to actually accomplish this. So the first and most important thing that you do is gathering equipment. I think the biggest mistake that people make when natural dyeing is that they don't use natural fibers. So one of the benefits of synthetic dye is that it will actually dye something called polyester, which is essentially a fabric that has fibers made of plastic. Now, those little pieces of plastic, the same way that if you put, grape juice in a plastic cup, it's not going to turn a different color. You can't really use natural dyes to dye plastic. So you have to make sure that you pick a natural fiber. And there's several types of natural fibers. You can do a protein-based one like wools, or you can do a cellulose-based one like cotton. So today we're actually dyeing with cotton. So 100% natural fiber is the way to go with this. The second thing is that you don't want to cross-contaminate. So although these are all, dinner scrap pieces, things that you've probably eaten before, you want to make sure that you have materials set aside just for your dyeing process. So we have some mason jars today. After you do this project, I wouldn't turn around and start trying to can something in those mason jars. I would just leave that as your dye jar for any future projects that you want to do. So the first step in the dyeing process after you've gathered your materials is going to be a pre-soak, and that's what we're doing right now. So what you're doing is you're soaking your fabric in water so that it can absorb all of that water, and we'll wring it out later. It helps to open up the fibers so that they'll take the dye really nicely. Now, a lot of people will add a mordant or a fixative into this pre-soak process. So mordants will actually help you help the color to stick to the fibers better. And fixatives make it so the color doesn't bleed off in the wash later. So actually everything we're dealing with today was pre-treated with an alum mordant that we did and then dried and then put it in the kit. So you already have a mordant all ready to go in your kits. Different types of mordants can be alum, iron, tin, copper, things like metals. And different types of fixatives can be salt, washing soda, or even vinegar can work as a fixative. It is important to note that sometimes these mordants and these fixatives can change the color of your dye. So a great example is the black bean that we're doing today, or some of you are doing today. If you were to add like an iron nail to that, this is what the normal color looks like. But if you were to add iron, it would actually make it a more intense blue because it changes it on a chemical level. And the same thing with certain fixatives. Black beans also are pH reactive, so is red cabbage. So if you were to put vinegar in with this, it would actually make it more of a pink color. So it's actually kind of a fun science. You can change the color of your dye based just off of the mordant or fixative that you add. So once you've got everything all pre-soaked and prepared, you've done all your prep work, and you get to start extracting the dye. And there's several ways that you can do this. I'd say the quickest way and the most common way is to actually simmer or boil your dye material in a pot of water. The heat helps it to release all that dye material quicker and efficiently. But since today we're doing solar dyeing, we're actually going to let the sun do all that energy for us. So we're going to pack everything in, and over several weeks, the heat will slowly heat up the dye materials and they'll slowly release over time. But with certain very pigmented dyes, kind of like what we're using today, turmeric and black bean, it doesn't even really need heat at all. If you were to place these mason jars in a dark corner for 4 weeks, they would still release enough dye to dye the fabric that we're working with today. So once you've extracted the dye, your next step is going to be to submerge the fabric. As a kind of a general rule, the longer you leave the fabric submerged in the dye, the more it's able to soak all that up and the stronger your color is going to be. On the other side of that, once you dump the dye out, you'll want to make sure that you rinse with cold water. And if you're going to press your napkins, do it with a low heat. Heat can affect the color after it's been dyed. All right, so we're gonna get started. If you haven't already, go ahead and get all of your materials in one place so that we're ready to go. We're gonna do just one step at a time. Feel free to ask if you have any questions or you need any clarification on the process. All right, so the first step that after you've soaked your fabric, we're gonna actually wring it out. If you haven't soaked your fabric or it hasn't soaked for a while, that's completely okay. The reason we soak the fabric is so that all of those fibers get all nice and plump with water, and then we wring them all out like wringing out a sponge. And then when we put water back in, it soaks it all back up. But that new water has all the dye materials in it. So soaking it just ensures that you get a more even color. So everyone take a second, take your little cloths, wring them out as much as you can so that they're just barely damp. All right.
And then, Jackie, really quick, we do have a question in the chat from Carol Straka. What types of dye materials do require light to work?
Do require, let me look at the question. Do require light. So certain types of dye materials can require things, more heat to them. So it kind of depends how sensitive the dye is. Trying to think of some good ones. So hibiscus is actually a great example. It is a lighter dye. It's not as pigmented, not as intense. And the more heat you provide to that, the more color you're going to extract from those flowers. So anything, I'd say things like rosemary, which can produce a really pretty yellow color. The more heat you add, the more of those yellow oils it'll produce. And the better it'll dye your fabric. Now, we're lucky because turmeric and black beans, which are the colors we're working with today, are very pigmented, and they're going to release a lot of dye very quickly for us. All right, so for tying up your fabric, so if you decide that you want to do the tie-dye, you don't have to. If you just want one solid color, you can. We recommend it because when you're natural dyeing like this and it's sitting still, since you're not stirring, sometimes you can get some little splotchy bits, and that always looks better when you do it with tie-dye. So we have an example of one that we did last week. This is the spiral technique, which is the last technique that we have up there. The first one is the accordion fold. So you'll actually fold your, I have a piece of paper to show you here. You'll fold your fabric one way, and then the other way, and then the other way. And you'll do that kind of like an accordion, and then you'll place rubber bands periodically throughout the paper. So that's that first technique. The second technique is where you lay out your fabric and you just scrunch it up in little bits wherever it looks good to you. Kind of if you've ever scrunched up focaccia in a nice focaccia bread, it's the same process. So you just scrunch it up in kind of whatever way you want, whatever way looks good. And once it's all scrunched, you wrap some of your rubber bands, which we have provided for you, around it in whatever way you like. Now, the last way is the spiral technique, which is what I'm going to be doing for mine because I want a nice little matching set. So for that, you lay your fabric out nice and flat. I have a little board to show you. You pinch in the center and you just twist. And you'll just keep twisting around. This is easier with two hands, I promise. Until you get it into a nice little spiral like this. And then you just place your rubber bands around the center. So make sure that they're tight enough that they're not going to fall out. Our goal is that we don't have any dye seep into the interior part. So you want it to be fairly tight into a nice little ball. Like I said, if you don't want to do the tie-dye, that is not required. It will still dye very prettily.
Really quick before we move on from the tie-dye, I just wanted to point out, so everyone's kit, we gave you all a mason jar. So those were jars that we went ahead and bought. But again, with the sustainability aspect, and Jackie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't have to be glass, correct, that you use to dye?
It does not have to be glass. For this example, it just has to be clear enough to be able to let heat transfer. Yeah. So we use glass because it's most efficient, but I've done this with plastic. The one you just saw was done with a plastic Tupperware container. So.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, and so I actually have, I don't know if everyone can see me here, but I have this wonderful juice jar that our director Julie gave me to use for this. So this is an example of just reusing materials that we already have to do these types of crafts. So you don't have to go out and buy a bunch of mason jars just to dye. You can definitely already use what you have at home. And then we also have another question in the chat from Mia. Will adding pennies to the bottom of the beans make a deeper blue?
So actually, pennies and copper will release a different type of material that'll actually create a more intense green color. Yes. So because of the oxidation of copper, it should create more of a green color. To be honest, I have never tested pennies as a mordant, so I cannot testify to that. But from my knowledge, that will work. Most dyers that I know actually will keep a jar that they keep old nails in and will fill it with water, because as it rusts, it creates more of that oxidized iron that you can then pour into dye mixtures instead of adding like actual metal bits. So I have a rust jar outside.
Cool.
All right, so while everyone's wrapping everything up, I'll go ahead and start working on step 3. But I can always take as much time as you need. No need to rush your tie-dye section. Ooh. All right, so for part 3, we're gonna be placing the dye material in our jar. So this part is a little bit more important for those of us who have turmeric than those of us who have black beans. With most powder dyes, you're gonna need about 1 tablespoon of powder dye for your nice little mason jar cup. The amounts don't have to be exact. Oddly enough, dyeing and dyeing fabrics is an exact science, but usually when you introduce a dye material, you're going to produce any type of color. But to get the same results over and over means that you have to take meticulous notes. So what I do is I keep all of mine in this nice, cute little dye book that I made out of actually naturally dyed materials. If anyone was curious what happens when you mix black bean and turmeric, it actually turns into this green color right here. So I actually, whenever I do a new dye, I always take a little test swatch and I write everything down from how long that I let it soak to what the temperature of the water was to, you know, how many ounces or how many grams of material I put in, and that'll help you recreate colors if that is your goal. But if you just want to dye something a pretty color, you can pretty much just dump dye material in and pour some water and it'll be good to go. The general rule is the more dye, the more color you're going to get out of it. So we're going to go ahead and start adding our dye to the jar. If you have turmeric like me, you're going to want to add about 1 spoonful or about half your dye material to the bottom of the jar. If you have black beans, you can go ahead and add half of your bag to the jar, but they're going to sink to the bottom anyway, so you can add the whole thing if you want. So I have a little spoon. I'm going to sprinkle mine to the bottom. Just kind of shake it out so it's nice in the bottom. Turmeric can get all over the place, so do make sure that you're doing this in a place that you're not too worried about getting a little bit of staining. All right, so once you get your turmeric nice and in the bottom, mine are nice tiny little balls, so we're just going to drop those in. You're going to drop one in, and then you're going to put the rest of the dye material on top of it to try and disperse it throughout your fabric. Where the dye material touches on your fabric will be more intense color. So for me, I have my little spoonful of turmeric, and I'm just going to sprinkle it in so that it gets dispersed all throughout. You can even give it a little zhuzh if you want. So then you're going to put your next piece on top. Get them all kind of combined together. You just want to spread it out so that it's covering as many parts of the fabric as possible. That's going to give you the most even color throughout. I'm actually, for this turmeric, I'm going to take mine, put the lid on, and give it a quick shake.
So did you put...
Yep, go ahead, sorry.
Did you put your stuff in there, your fabric in before?
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
do you put the turmeric in first or the fabric in first?
So you put half of the turmeric in first, and then you put the fabric in, and then you put the other half of the turmeric.
Okay. And to make that green color, so I have both the black beans and the turmeric. So can I do like half and half?
Yep, half and half. I would use only half of the black beans because they are very pigmented. Okay. So if you want it to be more of a blue, use more black beans, or blue-green. If you want it to be more of a yellowish green, use more turmeric. Okay. So there's actually two ways that you can achieve that color. You can mix them together at the same time, kind of like watercolors where you mix them together, or you can dye a piece of fabric yellow, let it dry, and then dye over it with a blue, and it'll create green also.
Okay. Thank you.
So I'll pause for a second. Does anyone else have any questions that I can answer? I know I'm blowing through this pretty quick.
Jackie, what would happen if you put the black beans directly like in your fabric and wrapped it up?
So any place that that black bean is pressing onto the fabric will create a really pretty, actually, kind of spurt of color. So let me see if I can show you on this piece that I did. So you can see these little colors right here. That's where black beans got tucked in my fabric when I put it in. So it actually creates a really intense spot of color. So if you're going for a very even dye, that may not be the technique for you. But if you want little dots of intense color, that is definitely the technique for you.
Thank you.
All right, so now that we've got all of our fabric and our dye added to our jars, step 4 is, I'd say, the easiest step. We are going to fill our jars with water. So the goal here is we want to fill the jar completely with water to the top so that it covers our fabric for us. If you want to use warm water, it'll help make the process a little bit faster because it helps those dyes release. But I am actually using ice cold water for mine, and it will still work just as fine.
So I'm sorry, I was trying to do this wrapping thing and not paying attention. So when you put the turmeric and the black beans, do you put some water with it to start with?
So go ahead and put all of your dye materials in first and get them all set up. And then once all your dye materials are in, you go ahead and fill it with water.
Okay.
Jackie, I have kind of like a history question for you. So what are some things that people, like the early settlers of McLean County, like what are some things that people would have dyed and why would they have dyed them?
Yeah, so I'd say the two most common, wool would have been dyed and used for yarn so that you could use it for knitting and things. It was a lot easier to get raw wool that wasn't pre-dyed than probably already dyed wool. So that would have been really common. But I'd also say re-dyeing clothing. So a lot of times if you had like a dress that you wore and maybe it was a lighter color and it was a little stained and it was a little old, you might have cut that up into pieces and dyed it and then used it to make a quilt. Because if you had like blue pieces and yellow pieces and orange pieces and you dyed all over top of it with a blue, all of those color schemes are going to work together. They're all going to look a little bit different, but they all have that blue undertone. So a lot of times they would take lighter clothing that was stained, so maybe a white church dress, and dye over it with a darker color, and it would become more of a work dress after that.
Interesting. Have you ever dyed like a large piece of clothing like that, Jackie?
So I have dyed some large pieces of clothing. A couple years ago, did a historically accurate petticoat that I hand stitched, used hand felling techniques, and I dyed it using cabbage, actually. And it came out a really pretty blue.
I'd love to see that. Okay.
Yes.
Cool.
So I see a question, is it normal for all the dye materials to fall to the bottom? So yes, it is normal for it all to fall to the bottom. If you can actually see on mine right here, it's sinking. Well, it doesn't show up as well on camera, but it's sinking towards the bottom. That is completely normal. Part of this process is every couple of days going out there and giving it a quick shake to kind of get those all floating back around. As they get more wet, they're going to release more of their dye material that's going to come out, and you're going to see that color darken a lot as the days go on. All right, so if we've all filled without a strong fixative. Okay, that is a great question on how much dye will fade from washing. So I'm actually going to flip to our next one because I do talk about light fastness. So these jars, we're going to let them sit in the sun for 2 to 4 weeks. The longer they sit, the more pigmented the color is going to be. I'd recommend going out every few days and giving it a brief shake. That is not required if you want it to be more tie-dye-y. So one of the downsides of natural dyes is that they can fade when they're exposed to heat and light. So if you leave it out to dry, I'd recommend not, putting it in the dryer if you can avoid it. They can start to fade, which can be a little sad. But the best thing about natural dyes is that if something fades and you really want that pretty color back, you can just re-dye it because there's no chemicals that are put in. They're not going to interact in a way that's going to produce a weird color. Sometimes if you dye over top of a synthetic dye, it can produce very ugly browns that can come out of that. But natural dyes, you can just keep building back on that color when it fades. So when you do take this out in 2 to 4 weeks, I would recommend rinsing it in cold water. If you want to add a little bit of salt to that water, it can help work as a fixative to keep your color potent. Rinse it in cold water, hang it up to dry. Once it dries, it should be good to go after that. Just low heat on an iron if you're going to iron them.
I have a quick question. So whenever this is sitting in the sun, is that best for it to actually be outside in a sunny spot? Or have you tried this at all where there's like a window that gets a lot of sun during the day? Can you have it inside, or is it better outside because of the heat?
So the goal for the sun is definitely the heat. It will work just fine in a sunny place in a window. You'll get plenty of sun energy in to get all of those colors releasing. This one that I actually did, I had sitting in front of a window for a week, actually 4 days. This color was produced in 4 days, to give you an idea. So yeah, sunny window works just fine.
Okay, great, thanks.
So at the very end, we're rinsing and we let it dry. And then should we put it in the dryer? Did you say to really set it, or?
So what you'll want to do is you'll actually want to let it air dry that first time. And as it dries that first time, that will set the color better. In the future, whenever you wash these, I would recommend washing it almost like you would wash delicates. So trying to use more cool water, not using any harsh soaps, and then not using very high heat when you wash it, because all of that can fade the color. Ooh, sorry, I saw a whole bunch of comments come in real quick. Follow-up email on fixative tips and suggestion for care of fabrics. Yes, we can definitely send a follow-up email that mentions all of this. So we did, looking at Carol Straka's comment, given your theme in the 1930s and 40s were natural dyes used much. So especially during times where other dyes could have been very limited. So, during World War II, when we kind of had a shortage of supplies, natural dyes were used a lot. They're a very cost-efficient way to freshen up colors and freshen up clothes that you already have. A lot of times when you can't go out and buy a new dress, the next best thing can be to dye it a very bright color that's a little bit more vibrant. And that we don't have any evidence that we've been able to find in like the Pantograph Negative collection that shows that happening, but we do know from just people explaining it that that was something very common during this time period.
Can fruits like black raspberries or blackberries be used to dye?
100%. They will produce a very pigmented color too. As anyone who has ever spilled blueberry jam on a napkin has seen, it will dye and it will stain. The best way to test if something will produce a dye is to actually take it, smush it between your fingers, and the color that it stains your fingers is usually the color it will stain any type of fabric. That can be a little bit different when you look at things like indigo, but those are more rare. Usually that rule works for most things. I am going to switch to our next slide. So as everyone's kind of finishing up their projects, I have a list of some other dyes that you might be interested in trying. And you can also see some other dyes on the back of your instruction sheet. Hibiscus will create a pink, turmeric will create a yellow, black beans a blue, coffee a brown, but we also have avocado pits and skins will create a very pretty pink color. Spinach will create a green color. Beets will produce a very dark red. And then red cabbage is a super fun thing if you're looking for something to do with kids, because if you add vinegar to it, it will produce a very bright purple. But if you add things like baking soda to it, it will produce more of a darker blue because it's pH reactive. So it's a great example if you're trying to teach kids about pH and what basic and acidic things are. That's always a fun one to try. All right. So that is pretty much the entire process. I'm going to open up the floor to any questions that anyone has that they might be interested in asking. Let's see. I think I missed one. All right, just to check with everyone, has everyone had the opportunity to put their dye into a jar and have it ready to go? All right, so in 2 to 4 weeks, you should have some lovely dinner napkins that you can take out and use. Thank you so much for joining us today. We do encourage you to join us next time on August 23rd, 6 p.m. We are continuing the fiber arts theme, and we are actually going to do a class on the basics of weaving. So if you've ever wanted to know how fabric is made, the process, and even make your own little tiny swatch, join us for that, and we will be teaching you. So I'm going to turn it over to Maria to do closing remarks.
Well, really quick, Jackie, we do have one more question in the chat from Carol Straka. Early settlers used detachable collars and perhaps other detachable elements. Does this crop up in the 20th century? Do you know, Jackie?
So the detachable collars and other detachable elements, you do see that crop up sometimes. You'll notice throughout fashion history, people are always taking ideas from earlier eras and incorporating it kind of into their own styles, and you kind of see these revivals, and we're actually seeing a revival right now of natural dyes, which is one of the things that kind of prompted us to do this. People are more concerned about sustainability, about being able to wear, natural fibers caught in the fabric of our life is a great example of that. So yeah, I would say that you see some of those elements popping up in modern day.
Okay, well, if nobody else has any more questions, thank you all so much for coming out. I think this was a really cool program, Jackie. I feel like everyone learned a lot. a really fun mix of history and science, I think, which is always really fun. But yes, just like Jackie said, join us next time on August 23rd at 6 p.m. Once again, I said this in the beginning, but we are moving this program to be a hybrid program. So it's going to be the same thing. We'll have kits for you all to pick up in the visitor center. We'll have more on cost if there will be cost later when we kind of figure out how much supplies are going to run. And you will be able to pick up those kits, and you can do it from the leisure of your own home and log on just like we are now. It'll be a live stream kind of situation, or you can actually come to the museum and you can interact with us as well. So we're really excited about that, giving people some options. We will have an elevator up and running, so it will be very exciting, and we will actually be able to go up and down the stairs with ease because we won't have to be running back and forth. So we're really excited for that. But yeah, thank you again for coming, and please feel free to email either Jackie or I with any questions or concerns, and we will send that follow-up that Candace suggested about some tips and tricks with naturally dyed items.
One quick question before you leave. Do you fill the jar all the way with water or just enough to cover the items?
So I recommend all the way, because you'll notice that they start to float a little bit towards the top. So the higher you fill it, the more it's going to get covered with dye.
And then if you're not going to be around for a week or so, is it all right if they just sit there without being turned, or should I have somebody turn them?
Nope, 100%. It can just sit there. It's going to make the tie-dye aspect much more bright. So it'll look really good in the end.
Okay, thank you. Great program.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. All right. Bye.
Goodbye.